Good afternoon, everyone. I am Sarah Beaton. I'm the Director of the Advanced Training and Research Division. And IFLE Senior Director Cheryl Gibbs is also on the line with us this afternoon, as well as members from the Advanced Training and Research Division and the International Studies teams. We welcome you to today's webinar on the Geographic World Area Requirement and Allowable Costs for the NRC and FLAS programs. This webinar is the second webinar in a series of webinars that our team will host during the next 12 months to review the recent revisions to 34 CFR Parts 656 and 657. We encourage you to attend all the webinars and bring a colleague if possible. Today's presentation focuses on the Geographic World Region Requirement for the upcoming NRC and FLAS competitions in fiscal year 2026. All webinars will be recorded and posted on our IFLE website. The final webinar of the year will be held on December 12th, and the first webinar in 2025 will be held on January 23rd. As many of you know, the National Resource Centers and Foreign Language Area Studies Fellowships programs are crucial to the U.S. Department of Education's mission to strengthen and promote international and foreign language education. The regulatory revisions were designed to improve the application and peer review processes, clarify terms and definitions, and strengthen program administration to support students, institutions, and educators in meeting the goals and objectives of the programs. The webinars are designed to emphasize major changes in the regulations so that you have a clear understanding as you prepare for future competitions. Presently, we are not discussing the mechanics of the competitions as we are months away from releasing the notices inviting applications. As we prepare for the upcoming competitions and finalize processes and procedures, we will provide detailed technical assistance on applying for the grant opportunities. We appreciate that you are a dedicated and diverse group of professionals who share a passion for advancing international education, and particularly the focus on less commonly taught languages. We encourage you to discuss, debate, and collaborate with your colleagues internally and externally as you pursue strategies to enhance and strengthen less commonly taught languages and area studies. This is an important moment to highlight how your programs are supporting and advocating for less commonly taught languages on your campuses. Whether through curriculum development, outreach initiatives, or student support, we encourage you to be bold and creative in advancing this goal. It is vital that we continue to build awareness and institutional support for these languages, many of which are underrepresented in higher education, yet critical for building a globally informed and prepared workforce. Thank you once again for your time, commitment, and your ongoing efforts to support international education and language learning. It is my pleasure to introduce Drs. Tim Duval and Brian Swick, who present the regulatory revisions for the Geographic World Region Requirement and Allowable Costs for NRC and FLAS. Please feel free to use the chat to ask any questions, and we will respond to them at the end of the presentation. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Tim.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to many of you to our ongoing webinars to help everyone understand what has changed with the new regulations. Again, as we talked about last time, the regulations to 34 CFR 655 are in effect, the new regulations. Those are mostly definitions and so on. 656 and 657, 34 CFR 656 and 657 will go into effect in August and will apply to the next round of the competition. Today, as Sarah noted, we are talking about the geographic world area changes that have been promulgated by the new regulations that will go into effect next August. I don't know if I can control the slides. Can I? I can. So, again, as Sarah said, if you have questions, please feel free to type them into the chat throughout the webinar. You can submit questions today or after today at the link that you see there, forms.office.com and so on. We just want to point out that all of your questions probably will not be answered during today's webinar. We will, again, as I talked about last time, we will be issuing sort of more formal responses to many of your questions in writing in the coming months. But please keep asking any questions that you have. We'll do our best to answer anything that we can answer today, and anything that we cannot, we will answer at a future date and make sure that everybody has access to those answers. Also, as you can see, we will incorporate responses throughout the webinar. One of the things that we're doing when we design these webinars is we're looking at the questions that have already been submitted to that form, and we are figuring out ways to include responses to those questions in the webinar. So we're sort of custom tailoring these webinars to the questions that you're already asking. So again, that's another reminder, keep asking these questions. And once again, to echo what Sarah said, specific details about the next competition are not yet ready. We're not going to be able to answer any questions that are specifically related to the upcoming competition. We just don't know those kinds of details yet. So today we're going to talk about the new geographical requirements. We're going to talk about the alignment with program purposes, which is actually something that we talked about in the previous webinar as well, but we want to connect this particular topic to that. Once again, we're going to talk about implementing new requirements, and we're going to go into some detail about allowable costs and activities. You're going to notice that there's a lot of information on these slides, and that I'm not, and Brian isn't either, going to read all of it in its entirety. It's meant as a reference for you. You will all get a copy of this webinar. This webinar is also being recorded so that you can watch it over and over and over again to keep you awake at night, perhaps. But we're going to cover a lot of information, but there's going to be a lot written down that I'm not going to read and that Brian's not going to read. We're instead going to summarize as best we can. And also, please note that much of what's included in this on these slides is material that's written in the new regulations, or written in the explanations that we did in the NFR, the Notice of Final Regulation, and in the NPRM, the Notice of Proposed Regulations. So you can always refer to those as well to find even more information. So the new geographical requirements. So all applicants to the NRC and FLAS programs are required to identify a geographical area of focus. Here we're talking specifically about NRC, and the idea is to increase the emphasis on languages and on the world regional or area of focus in a global or international context. We want you to, and you will be required to, support a way of synthesizing area, global, and international studies. What this will do is eliminate the standalone international program category in the next competition. Current international grantees can continue to operate the way they always have, all the way through the end of this cycle and into any no-cost extension. But after this, in the next competition, that program category will be eliminated. And you can see some discussion of this below, and this is taken from the new regulation 656.3, what defines a comprehensive or undergraduate national resource center. And you'll see the area focused under A1, the area of focus must be a geographic world area or a geographically designated region that spans multiple world areas. So we're not, the new requirements will not require you to focus on just one world area. You can devise ways, and we'll give some examples of this later, to connect world areas. We have included quite a bit of flexibility here. And then this is just to point out that NRC and FLAS have similar expectations. Again, if you look under 657.3, A1, you'll see a geographic world area, geographically designated region that spans multiple world areas. and serves as the focus of research, teaching, training, and instruction. So for FLAS, you need to do the same thing. You need to locate your grant geographically. And again, there is flexibility, and we'll talk about that.
Okay, Tim, I'll jump in here and talk about the alignment with the program purposes. And as Tim mentioned, this is something that we alluded to in the previous webinar, and we'll just briefly review some of the changes that have occurred, particularly in 655, as well as in the NRC and FLAS program regulations. So this harkens back to the previous webinar when we reviewed the changes to Part 655 of 34 CFR. This is simply to point out that the NRC and FLAS fellowships programs are part of a larger group of programs authorized by the Higher Education Act of 1965 as amended. And as so-called Part A programs, they share in a common set of purposes identified by Congress, which you can see listed here, broadly indicating support for centers, programs, and fellowships at institutions of higher education, as well as the development of a pool of experts, the validation of specialized materials and techniques for foreign language acquisition and fluency, the promotion of access to research and training overseas, advancement of internationalization, and support for cooperative efforts to promote access to and dissemination of international and foreign language knowledge, teaching materials, and research. These are very broad purposes, and it's not necessarily the case that every Title A program shares in all of these exactly the same way, but collectively, all of the Title A programs contribute to these purposes. And to this end, we've tried to highlight this connection in the changes to, in this case, 656.1 as well as 657.1 for the NRC and FLAS programs, respectively. And in this case, that second paragraph B links back to that larger set of purposes in which all of the Title VI Part A programs share. And then paragraph A, which you see here, ultimately deals with the 4 primary purposes of the National Resource Centers program, which are the teaching of modern foreign languages, especially less commonly taught languages, instruction in fields of study needed to provide full understanding of areas, regions, or countries in which such languages are commonly used, research and training in international studies, and the international and foreign language aspects of professional and other fields of study, and instruction and research on issues in world affairs that concern one or more countries. And this list is very important because this ultimately animated our decision to implement the geographic world area requirement because of that and as it's placed there in paragraph 3, which says that all National Resource Centers programs need to contribute to all 4 of these purposes, which ultimately requires linking up the teaching of languages, area studies, as well as international affairs and international studies into one package in one center. So under the new regulations, we expect all National Resource Centers to be participating in all of these endeavors. And that's why we emphasize the and here. The changes are a little less dramatic here, which is to say that the FLAS Fellowships program remains dedicated to supporting fellowships for modern foreign language and area studies. But again, this really highlights that connection to a world area or a world region in both of these programs. And as you can see here in paragraph B, there's again an attempt to link back the purpose or the explanation of the FLAS Fellowships program back to the common purposes of the Part A Title VI programs, and especially the development of a pool of international experts to meet national needs. And as I already alluded to, we view these changes as ultimately reinforcing the connection between area and international studies rather than eliminating or changing the program's commitment to both. We see these as ultimately being complementary aspects of the centers and more broadly of the programs that they support. And we see these as interwoven throughout the authorizing legislation for these programs. And we really do think that asking centers and programs to explicitly identify a geographic world area will help build that alignment between not only what they're doing, but also the recommendations provided in the context on the consultation of areas of national need for expertise in foreign languages and world regions required by the authorizing statute.
As I mentioned earlier, we do plan to talk to you now about flexibility. Under the final regulations, the regulations that were published in the Federal Register, centers will retain the flexibility to define their geographic area of focus, which may be a traditionally recognized world region. It could be a single country, or it could be another configuration of space that draws attention to world issues, peoples, related languages outside of the United States, et cetera. So there's nothing in the new regulations that precludes the creation of alternative configurations of space that overlap, replace, or change other categories that are defined in geographic terms. And we're providing one example here. Lusophone communities in Africa, Sufi communities in Southeast Asia, Japanese diaspora communities in South America are all possible geographic areas of focus that could be used and that could play to the strengths that you have on campus. And furthermore, applications that propose a geographic area of focus that span more than one world area still meet the geographic focus requirement. So in this slide, we can see that I don't know if is this the right slide? Let's see. No, okay, yeah, we're ahead of one. So this just shows how we demonstrated or applied area of focus to the NRC review process. So how does the Secretary select applications for funding for the NRC program? You can see it here. The Secretary evaluates an application for a comprehensive center under the criteria that are contained below. So those criteria are spelled out. But in every case, there needs to be a connection. You can see this in paragraph C. There needs to be a connection to the geographic area of focus. In particular, it calls attention to the regulation that we referred to on a previous slide, 656.3 subparagraph A. So applications that share a similar area of focus will be grouped together for the purposes of review. And every application is evaluated or reviewed for excellence based on the criteria that are referenced in the regulations. The same thing is true for the FLAS review process. Once again, we connect to 657.3 paragraph A. And again, they will be grouped together and reviewed, taking into account the excellence of the proposal. There's more in there about how money is allocated and so on. You can read that on your own. I encourage you to read all of this very, very closely in the coming months. Read and reread to make sure that you understand what has changed, what applies to you, and so on. And then if we look in the selection criteria, we can see this area of focus playing out. Again, there's a reference to 656.3A. So the extent to which this is for NRC 656.21 and 22, when we're talking about, say, for example, center scope, personnel, and operations, the Secretary reviews the application to determine one or more of the following. One, the extent to which the proposed center's area of focus meets the requirements in 656.3A. So again, you'll need to take note of the requirements in 656.3A as you're preparing your application for these selection criteria. And you'll see it all the way through. There's a reference to area of focus over and over and over again, referring back to 656.3A. Same thing for FLAS, as you can see, 657.21, same thing. think we're having trouble here. Is this where we're supposed to be, Brian?
Yes, we're still talking about the selection criteria, correct?
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. I don't know how we're getting so far. Okay, yeah, right. So it would be this one right here. Sorry about that. So again, here's another example of how the area of focus applies in the selection criteria. Under project design and rationale for NRC, and under project design and rationale for FLAS. So here is an example of a world area. Maybe Brian, do you want to do this?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in here. And so in the next few slides, we're going to walk through some examples that we would deem provisionally eligible according to the geographic world area requirement mentioned above. Tim already mentioned in passing some of the examples that appeared in the notice of the final rule. Here we'll offer some more. And for each of these slides, we've tried to illustrate a place on the globe to some extent on the left-hand side, and on the right, you'll see a representation of the form as it should appear more or less like this in the application package that will be released next year. This is a very similar form to that which was used in previous competitions. One of the notable differences, although it will be very small, although if you use some of the tools available on your screen, you may be able to zoom in. You'll see that the international category, which previously had been listed under that world region focus portion of the form, is no longer available. Again, this is intentional, in line with the discussion we've been having about the world area geographic requirement. And this also is meant to signal that we do not anticipate having a replacement multi-region category that will be a catch-all for these types of applications. Instead, we're trying to show how one might deal with this form if one has a multi-region type application in mind. And in this particular case, we're showcasing an example. These are only examples. We do not necessarily endorse any of these or show preference for any of these formations. We're simply using examples that we've heard about out in the field and trying to map them to the form of the process that Tim was describing above. And so in this particular case, if an applicant came to us with this type of framework, we might advise them on this application profile form to use the world region focus area to tick off boxes for all of the regions listed that they thought were appropriate. And in this case, this would mean to accommodate an Arctic world area, to tick off the box for Russia, Eastern Europe, and Eurasia, Western Europe, and the Western Hemisphere. And in this particular case, you'll notice that we have depicted the ticking of these boxes using X's in at least two colors, blue and either orange or red. And in this case, we use the red or orange X for Western Hemisphere, because in this particular case, the hypothetical applicant noted that although they intend to focus on the entire Arctic world area, that in fact, they may view their, let's say, strength at slightly over half, maybe 51%, concentrated in that Western Hemisphere portion of the Arctic. So again, this is just their attempt to signal all the areas they touch upon, as well as their particular area of concentration. And then these are things we could take into account when trying to work out what the similar groupings are. Using another example featuring a cultural but also geographical basis here would be a Buddhist world area focused on East Asia, Pan-Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. And again, you'll notice that in this particular configuration, essentially the applicant would be ticking all of the Asia-related categories. And again, this is an example of what we would view as provisionally eligible using the new requirement. But as Tim mentioned, in those initial selection criteria for both the FLAS and NRC programs, there is an attempt, or there is the space for you to articulate how the region that you will propose to focus on meets the geographic world area requirements. And this would allow you to provide a theoretical or intellectual or practical justification for how this region meets the geographic world area requirement. And again, using another example here for an Atlantic Ocean world area, right? Ticking the boxes for Africa, Western Europe, and the Western Hemisphere, again, using that heavy marking to indicate where this applicant may feel, the preponderance of their strength may be despite the coverage here. And again, this is an attempt to be flexible and accommodate these multi-region applications, but also within the framework of some of the administrative categories that we have. However, you should keep in mind that the most important thing when working on these multi-region applications is to simply write an excellent application that showcases the particular strengths of your institution. You should be confident that we will ensure that there is a fair and equitable review for all applications, and that applications that do show excellence will rise to the top of this process that was described in the regulations that Tim discussed earlier. And we want to reassure you that we've dealt with variations of the fluidity of regional boundaries before. And in these situations, we have been able to draw on reviewers from multiple categories, if necessary, to ensure that the proper expertise was matched to the applications that we've received. And on this slide, we've just highlighted some of the flexible world area categories that we've dealt with before that have sometimes called upon this type of approach and flexibility in trying to map the applications we receive with the categories that we use and the particular sorts of strength that are required. Which is to say that although this multi-region approach is on the one hand new under the new program regulations, it's a version of an approach that we've dealt with before, and we feel confident that we can deliver that fair review process for all applications. And we really are open to receiving these. And we do hope that this is an exciting opportunity for applicants in the field to think in these ways, as well as also to continue submitting applications under those single world area categories as well. Now, switching gears a little bit, in terms of nuancing what we mean by a world area, we do want to emphasize that the core focus of the FLAS and NRC programs remains predominantly international or global in some respects, which is to say that the United States is not regarded as one of the appropriate world areas or world regions for these programs. This is not new. This has been an aspect and an animating force behind the programs for decades, but we wanted to offer some clear guidance here about what that really means, because these are questions that we get periodically. Now, although the United States can never be the predominant or major focus of the NRC or FLAS programs, we do know that sometimes the US does have a global presence, and particularly in carrying out the diverse perspectives mandate, you may need to consider the role of the United States or of US territories in a larger global context. We would typically view this as fine, but again, the predominant focus needs to be on areas outside the United States and languages that have that international component to them. And we've used the example of Guam obviously being part of the Pacific Ocean, so it may be necessary to include a Guam type perspective in the context of the Pacific, but a center focused on Guam would obviously not be appropriate in this context. Similarly, indigenous languages of the United States without that international perspective or that international connection would not really be appropriate to fund or support through these programs. And again, this has come up before, that there may be the ability to use the framing of global regions, such as global Africa, global Asia, which are quite common, or other transnational or international framings to address topics such as diasporic communities. But again, it's really about the framing of these particular topics and to preserve that focus on the international, regional, or global elements in all cases. Now, Tim, I'm going to turn it back to you for allowable costs and activities.
That sounds good. Before I get into that, let me just echo one thing that Brian just said. When we started this project of rewriting these regulations, what motivated it was the selection criteria. The selection criteria that we had been using before were complicated, they were overlapping, it was difficult to get a nice round score of 100 for the review and so on. And so what motivated the change was that. We ended up making quite a few other changes along the way, as you know, but I want to go back to that, to the selection criteria. We think that we have designed much better selection criteria. They're more streamlined, they make more sense. There isn't overlap between categories and so on. And we encourage you to carefully read the new selection criteria and design your proposals based on addressing those selection criteria, as Brian was saying earlier. In many ways, nothing is changing about the way that we review these. We've dealt with these world areas for many cycles. We've dealt with interesting combinations of world areas for many cycles. But now we have selection criteria that we think clarify the entire process, both for you, for us, and for the reviewers who will be reviewing. So we encourage you to really get to know those selection criteria, and as you're designing your proposals, to make sure that you're finding good ways to express exactly how you're going to satisfy those criteria in your projects. So allowable costs and activities, I'm going to go through a little bit here, just to sort of help you understand and set up some examples that we will discuss relating to allowable activities and costs. So it's 656.30. We can see paragraph A, we can see the allowable activities and costs. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'll go through some of them. A grant awarded under this part, which is an NRC grant, may be used to pay all or part of the cost of establishing, strengthening, or operating a comprehensive or undergraduate center, including but not limited to the cost of the following. So all of these, the 14 that follow, are costs that are allowable. You're not necessarily limited to these, but these are clearly expressly allowable. So supporting instructors of the less commonly taught languages related to the center's area of focus, that's allowable. Creating, expanding, or improving opportunities for the formal study of the less commonly taught languages related to the center's area of focus, that's allowable. Creating or operating summer institutes in the United States or abroad designed to provide modern foreign language and area training in the center's area of focus, that's allowable. So as you'll see, and I've been emphasizing it, at the end of every one of these, just about, if not everyone, is the center's area of focus. So you should be designing your projects with that in mind. What is your area of focus? Make sure you have it clearly configured, and then fit the activities that you want to include in your project into that. And again, you're going to see that over and over again in these things. And again, there's more and more here, planning or developing curriculum related to the center's area of focus, funding salaries and travel for faculty and staff related to the center's area of focus, and so on. That should be your guiding principle, your area of focus. And so you want to make sure that you know exactly what it is and that you're explaining it clearly to the reviewers. And again, that you're doing it within the context of the selection criteria, being sure to answer all of the elements that are included in the new selection criteria. When it comes to limitations on costs or activities, you can find this in 656.30b. So here are some of the limitations. I'm not going to go through all of them. But there are a couple of ones that are particularly important. Number 5, costs for you all already know this, but it's always good to emphasize. Costs for international travel are only available if a center has obtained prior approval from the secretary. Okay, that's a regulation. That's part of our regulatory framework. And this is why we can't approve travel after it has already happened. The approval needs to happen prior to the travel. Activities must be relevant to the center's area of focus and the type of center. So if you're applying for a comprehensive center, then the activities that you propose need to be relevant to that. If you're applying as an undergraduate center, they need to be relevant to that. And if you look at number 7, you'll see an undergraduate center's project and related activities must predominantly benefit the instruction and training of undergraduate students. So if you're applying as an undergraduate center, it's essential that you design your activities such that they predominantly benefit the instruction and training of undergraduate students. That goes back to a point that Brian made earlier regarding the program purposes. All of our programs fit together in a certain logic, and that logic is explained in 655 that we talked about on the last webinar. Part of the logic here, and this is the way the statute was written, is to conceive of undergraduate centers as sort of feeders into further advanced study. So the program is designed to make sure that undergraduate students are getting the kind of training that they need to take the next steps in their training, to become maybe to go to graduate school, maybe to do something else. But the idea is that the undergraduate center is a pipeline to something else. And so that's why this is now emphasized. We emphasize that the activities that an undergraduate center do must benefit the instruction and training of undergraduate students. Also, we just want to quickly point out, not going to make a big deal out of this, but the supplement but not supplant provision. So if you look at on the left side of the slide, the blue in the blue, you'll see these are activities and resources that are already funded by a college or university. When you apply for an NRC, you're adding activities to that. That's the orange, the grant project. Okay, you're supplementing what you're already doing. That's the idea, or what you plan to already be doing. If you're establishing a center, excuse me. If you're establishing a center, you're going to have activities and resources already in place that are funded by the college or the university. Don't lose my voice, Brian.
I can jump in for a second. And as Tim was saying, is just remember that the grant projects are inspiring new activities and contributing to the program purposes we mentioned earlier. And so even with the establishment of a center, keep those 4 core purposes of the NRC in mind, right? Focusing on language and a holistic understanding of a world area, as well as the connection to international studies and research. And so, the operation and establishment of a center or the strengthening of a center could be understood in those terms, right? That's really the goal of what we mean by center, in distinction to what a university may define as a center. And so this is not meant to be that frightening, but this is just part of the expectation for the NRC program to think in those additive terms. And with that in mind, and Tim, if you're feeling better, feel free to take over. Are you back?
I don't know if I do. I don't know if I am or not. I mean, I feel fine, but I guess my voice is working again.
Right.
So here's a question: should we fund this NRC project activity? As you're considering your application, that might be a question that you would or should ask yourself. So any activities that are not explicitly disallowed by 656, by 34656, by 34 CFR 7.5, or by 2 CFR 200, and any other relevant federal regulations, may be allowable under the NRC program if the costs are reasonable, the benefits are proportional to the cost, and the alignment with the program purpose is clear. So these are the things that you should be thinking about when you're asking this question: should we fund this project activity? Is it allowed by these particular provisions? Is it could it be allowable in the NRC program? Well, if the costs are reasonable, benefits proportional, and so on, maybe they are. So here are 6 questions to consider when you're selecting or designing activities. I'm actually going to go through all of these really quickly, if my voice holds up. Is the activity feasible given the available resources and likely to be allowable according to institutional policies, so policies on your campus, as well as federal regulations? Is it responsive to the needs or opportunities that this particular NRC grant that you're proposing is seeking to address during the grant cycle? Is it within the scope of the characteristics that define a comprehensive undergraduate NRC? So are you making sure that you're clear that you're designing a comprehensive center or an undergraduate center? Is the activity aligned with the purposes of the NRC program? And also, going back to what Brian was talking about earlier, more generally with the purposes of the Title VI Part 8 programs, sort of writ large. So again, we talked about this before, but we're asking you to think about your project within that bigger scope. That's the connection to 655 in this case, again, as we talked about last time. Is the cost proportional to the likely benefit? And in particular, as it relates to achieving the intended outcome of the project. And then finally, is the entire portfolio of activities that you're proposing likely to achieve the project's intended outcomes? So this is just a sort of pretty quick guide, actually, to help you think through the activities that you want to propose. And we think that if you do this, you're gonna really provide a strong application. So Brian's going to give an example here.
We're just going to walk through two examples that try to apply the 6 questions that Tim mentioned. And so in this first scenario, we're asking all of you to enter into the context of a proposed East Asia Comprehensive Center with an intended outcome of strengthening training and research related to East Asia by increasing opportunities to incorporate perspectives of minoritized peoples and languages in course offerings, program requirements, and published research to promote comprehensive understanding of regional and international issues. That's the general context, the very brief abstract of an entire project, and the activity we'll consider in this case would be the use of NRC funds to hire a Uyghur language instructor at 100% FTE for 4 years of the project to pilot several courses and to develop performance goals for these courses. And although you may jump to a certain answer based on what Tim was saying, we just wanted to quickly walk you through the 6 questions and how they would apply in this particular case. Right, so with that first question, is the activity feasible given the available resources? And in this case, we would say it's feasible, and based on the regulations, it should be allowable. Right, particularly under the program regulations, 100% of less commonly taught language instructors can be funded using NRC grant funds. Then we could ask, is the activity responsive to needs or opportunities for the grant cycle? And in this case, we would turn to the context that I described and say that in this case, yes, right? At the core of the proposed activity is training related to minoritized, less commonly taught languages, and therefore it would seem to fit within that framework. Now, is the activity within the scope of the characteristics that define, in this case, a comprehensive NRC? And the answer would be yes, again, because it is targeted toward that key aspect of the NRC program related to the instruction of modern lictals, particularly adding capacity where it doesn't already exist. Then we could ask that question about alignment with program purpose. And again, yes, based on the program regulations and everything that Tim and I have been talking about, the instruction of less commonly taught languages, particularly modern less commonly taught languages, makes it a shoe-in for this type of consideration and alignment with program purposes. Then we have that question about proportional benefit and cost. And in this case, again, yes, adding new language courses that meet students' educational goals would seem to offer that payoff, presuming that students were likely to exist or are proven to already exist. And again, that focus on adding capacity really makes it perhaps quite reasonable as a project activity. And then again, is the entire portfolio of activities for this proposed project likely to achieve the project's intended outcomes? Obviously, we would need to continue imagining what the project would be seeking to do, but in the provisional thought experiment that Tim and I have outlined here, we would say yes. Based on the context, this activity would seem to contribute to that larger portfolio of activities. And so, not just the activity in isolation, but understood in terms of the entire group of activities being conducted, it does seem to be moving in a common direction, aligned with the resources that are available, and would accord with all the relevant program and federal regulations and really make sense as an activity. So we might conclude that this would be a good activity to fund if this were the project you were thinking about. In the next scenario,
I can do this one, Brian. I can do this one, Brian.
Go for it.
Since I do the Middle East world area, I might as well do the one that proposes a Middle East undergraduate center. So here's the context for our second example. We have a proposed Middle East undergraduate center with an intended outcome of strengthening undergraduate teaching about the Middle East by creating several new interdisciplinary courses that intentionally include STEM approaches as a component of a regional focus within a new international studies major. And here's a proposed activity within that context. Use only NRC funds to support a series of all-inclusive 2-week interdisciplinary conferences in Helsinki and Buenos Aires for 300 faculty members and advanced PhD students from several universities to present research on water use in the Middle East. Oops. So given that context and that proposed activity, we can walk through the six questions to consider. Is the activity feasible given available resources and likely to be allowable according to institutional policies and federal regulations? And the answer is likely yes, based on regulations. Relevant conferences that disseminate technical information are allowable under program regulations. But further scrutiny of proposed expenses is necessary because of general cost limitations apply. For example, you can't use federal funds for entertainment or alcohol. But even so, if it doesn't include any limited or cost prohibitive activities or components, then likely this is okay. Is the activity responsive to the needs or opportunities that this NRC grant is seeking to address during the grant cycle? Maybe, based on the context. So the interdisciplinary conference may include faculty involved in undergraduate education, but more explanation would probably be required to clarify the relationship between the conferences and the development of undergraduate courses. So in other words, the activity that's proposed probably would probably need more detail, a more detailed explanation. Is the activity within the scope of the characteristics that define an undergraduate NRC? No, and this is based on both context and regulations. Using all or most of the project funds for this activity is unlikely to predominantly benefit undergraduate education because the activity supports the dissemination of advanced research without a clear connection to the undergraduate curriculum. I think that's pretty clearly the case in the way that this particular activity is described. Of course, Brian is the one who described this, so he described it in this particular way to help make this point. Is the activity aligned with the purposes of the NRC program and more generally with the purposes of the Title VI Part A programs? We can say based on what is provided here, maybe. The activity may support developing a full understanding of a world region, but we'd probably need to know more. We'd probably need more explanation about what the activity exactly will accomplish and in what context. Is the cost proportional to the likely benefit? And the answer to this is no, based on context. Several conferences outside the United States for many attendees without clearly explained relevance to the project's intended outcomes seem unlikely to provide a program benefit proportional to the proposed cost. And then finally, is the entire portfolio of activities likely to achieve the project's intended outcomes? This looks unlikely based on the context that's provided. The proposed activity is likely to consume most of the grant budget without directly contributing to achieving the intended outcome. So the likely conclusion is that you probably would not want to fund this activity unless you redesign it, unless you provide more context, more explanation that would help change some of those answers that are no or maybes into yes. So some notes on NRC project activities. The NRC program is able to fund many types of activities, provided that they support area studies and foreign language education. Every application is different, and the educational needs and opportunities at any particular institution or in any particular field can vary. So we suggest that you identify activities that will contribute to achieving the project's intended outcomes, which means that you need to think about what the intended outcomes of the project are, and you need to think about how those fit into the bigger picture that we've been talking about that's presented in 655, and that's connected to 655 in the regulations of 656 and 657. So we encourage applicants to explore a broad range of possible activities when designing a proposal. So here's one example. Off-campus outreach activities might become increasingly difficult to execute if a robust array of area studies and foreign language educational resources are not available on college and university campuses. Off-campus outreach also may be a means of increasing enrollments or achieving other goals in relation to educational needs or opportunities. If an applicant already allocates a lot of resources to support one or more activities, enter one or more of the characteristics of the relevant type of center listed in 656.3. An applicant may identify needs or opportunities related to other intended outcomes that call for other types of activities. I'll let Brian do this note.
Sure, and this builds upon those 6 questions in some respects that we were talking about earlier. But this is just thinking about how to select project activities and thinking about the connection with evaluation. And, just again, hammering home that idea, we encourage you to think broadly, to develop projects that are responsive to current educational needs and to address those opportunities and needs in those fields. And this really builds upon what's stated in the selection criteria. So again, whether we're talking about today's topics or even in future webinars, just remember that the selection criteria really drive what you should be thinking about when you're putting an application together. And remember that included in the selection criteria is a consideration of potential for long-term impact. And so we really do think that successful applicants should identify high-quality project activities aligned with program purposes that enable an applicant to achieve a project intended outcomes, and those intended outcomes really ought to incorporate those long-term impacts, not just thinking about this very small immediate payoff of what you may be envisioning when applying for this program. And again, we also encourage grantees and applicants to use formative and summative evaluation practices to determine whether specific activities are contributing to the intended outcomes of the projects. And again, applicants or grantees may wish to revise or replace project activities that do not adequately contribute to achieving a project intended outcomes. So again, I hope that you take away from today's discussion, as well as our other discussions in other webinars, that we really are looking for the alignment of all of these aspects, right? Choosing high quality activities that align with the program purposes and developing the wraparound procedures and processes that help you identify and promising activities and weed out those that are less promising, so that there's a real theory and justification for why you're doing what you're doing, and that way ensuring that there's that alignment in your local context, in your institutional context, and then more broadly in the national context through these programs. And this is just a reminder that we do not require returning applicants to continue funding the same activities across multiple grant cycles unless they also are contributing the intended outcomes that you're seeking. So there's no expectation that you would keep doing the same thing if you're a returning grantee under the new regulations, unless you believe it helps you attain or achieve those long-term intended impacts that you're seeking. Tim?
So here are some more notes for you. We don't have any minimum number of project activities for a grantee in the program regulations. So you don't have to do a minimum of 3 or a minimum of 10 or whatever. What we're asking you to do, and we're going back to this over and over and over again, is to design a project that responds to identified educational needs or opportunities, and then to communicate that plan clearly to the reviewers with an emphasis on identifying project activities that are likely to contribute to the intended outcomes of the project. So again, we are asking you to think about the intended project outcomes, and then to fit that within the program that or the project that you're proposing and designing, as well as into the general sort of program purpose. Because again, the purpose of these grants isn't to just throw money on your campus, right? The purpose of these grants is to ask you to do a job for us, for the country, to make sure that we have experts out there, that we're leveraging the expertise that you have on your campus to create more expertise and to educate the population or the public with regard to these particular issues. So think about what the intended outcomes of your project are, fit those into the program purposes, and then you can decide, again, using the 6 criteria that we've laid out already, whether or not you want to fund any particular activity. So funding numerous activities that collectively contribute little to realizing the project's intended outcome might not be particularly effective. It might be more effective to design fewer project activities that are more likely to achieve the project's intended outcomes. I'm sure you're noticing that Brian and I are saying that over and over and over again, intended outcomes, right? This should be what's driving you as you conceive of your projects, and as you're fitting your projects with its intended outcomes into the program purposes writ large. When it comes to the value of selection criteria and scoring of applications, we publish selection criteria. We do that with associated values and priorities for each competition. They can change. We had particular selection criteria for the last one. We're going to have new ones for this one. But then there are also priorities. Those priorities can change. And we had priorities for the last one. And we might well have priorities for the next one. We don't know anything about that yet. As you may know, there's a new administration coming in, and we don't know at all what their goals might be for our programs. And so we'll find that out in due course, and see if there are any priorities that they want to include. But that's not anything that we can say definitively at this point. We have no idea. However, the program guidance from the previous grant cycle is available on our website, and that can provide some sort of guide. There might be some changes in priorities, but the structure of the programs themselves have not changed. We've changed the selection criteria. We've changed a few other things along the way to try to help you design your projects in a way that fits into the program purposes, and also to try to help us help the reviewers review your applications. But the programs themselves, the structure of them is essentially the same as Brian talked about in the last webinar, whenever that was, in October. No matter what, applicants have to demonstrate excellence when responding to the selection criteria and competition priorities, no matter what they are. All of the selection criteria are important, and the reviewers evaluate applications on the basis of those. So going back to what Brian and I have both already said during this webinar, make sure you understand the new selection criteria and make sure that you're designing your application and your project with those selection criteria in mind, in particular with addressing those selection criteria as clearly as you can and demonstrating the excellence of your project.
And I would just add one more thing, which builds upon what Tim just said, which is that we often get a question to the effect of, does IFLE want X activity? And the answer is, I think, based on what we've been saying today, really complex, because it really must take into consideration the context in which you're operating and the alignment with the program purposes. And you, in many respects, will be the best judges of that. And just remember to frame those activities in the terms we've been talking today, and to really seek out activities that you think will have those long-term impacts that will achieve the outcomes that you're seeking. And if you're writing the best possible applications, then hopefully the reviewers will be able to recognize that and build the strongest case for those activities. And so it's a really much more complex answer than we like this or we don't like this. We really want to see very strong applications, and what a strong application looks like really depends upon what you're bringing to the table and how you're designing everything together as a package. And just to, again, call back to what Tim was just saying, particularly in terms of the FLAS, as we shift to this last section of the allowable cost discussion, a lot hasn't changed, right? Which is to say that when we're talking about the FLAS Fellowships program, the basic payment structure that has been in place for years will remain in force under the new regulations, which is to say that fellows will receive a payment for tuition and fees called the institutional payment, as well as a stipend payment. And there have been some tweaks that we'll discuss in a future webinar dedicated primarily to FLAS, but the basic payment structure will remain in place. And you can see the relevant section here. And these two activities, essentially the institutional payment and a stipend payment, remain the primary allowable costs for the FLAS Fellowships program. There are no administrative costs allowed for the FLAS Fellowships program. And here you can see the new definitions of institutional payment, stipend, and travel allowance. And again, we'll go into these changes in greater detail on the webinar related to FLAS administration changes. Tim, you want to wrap up for us?
Yes, I do. So that concludes the content of this particular webinar. Please, if you have questions, start asking in the chat or in the Q&A section, and we'll see what we can answer today. And anything we can answer today, we will take into consideration for future feedback that we will provide. But we have some pretty exciting things coming up. In fact, next week is International Education Week, and our crew in our office, one of whom is here, Amy Marion, have been involved in designing some interesting programming. In particular, there is an event on, I believe it's Tuesday, November 19th from 8:30 a.m. to 11 a.m. Eastern time. It can be attended in person or virtually. If you're going to either way, you need to register, and there's information at these links for you to register. But as you can see, there's a lineup of very interesting speakers talking about the perspectives on the future of international education, a topic that is always important for us, and in our view for our country. If you have specific questions about the regulations, here are links. It's the same thing that we provided last time. The link to the notice of the final rule. This provides explanations and the full text of the new regulations, and the notice of proposed rulemaking, which provides additional explanations. Again, as we said last time, in the notice of proposed rulemaking, we explained what were the proposed new regulations, and in the final rule, we explained the final regulations. Okay, and so in the final regulations, there are still some elements that we covered in the notice of proposed rulemaking. So both documents apply. They're both important, and they both provide explanations. But only the notice of the final rule has the final new regulations included in it. When those regulations become active, 655 is already active. You'll be able to find it on the ecfr.gov site. For 656 and 657, when they become active next year in August, they will be available there as well. But before then, you can find them here in this document, in the Notice of Final Rule. Also, the update team, that's me and Brian. If you have questions, those are email addresses. Please feel free to reach out to us. And finally, here are good ways to connect with us. We have a YouTube channel. We have an IFLE newsletter. Our website has been updated. If you haven't been on it, it looks and feels quite a bit better than the previous one, and you can find lots of information there that's pretty neatly organized. And then finally the Twitter account. Again, feel free to stay in touch with us. I highly recommend registering for the IFLE newsletter. There's a lot of information there. The YouTube channel too. I think that's where this recording is going to end up. So you can find it there if you need to review what we just discussed. So thank you all for your attention and for being here.